Are there any things you don't like about Jetpack Compose, or is it just completely positive for you compared to XML?
Yeah, so I think that there are things that sometimes bother me, but I think that all of these details, like for example, sometimes the syntax doesn't really seem that clear for some APIs. I think that sometimes the ID, for example, doesn't import what it should import, right? So if you try to bundle all of this together, sometimes I don't like some of the stuff, but if you would be to I don't know, try to weigh all of these things that you don't like and try to think of the alternative, which is obviously XML with the view system, you would see that the actual scale of things that you don't like in XML is much higher. So again, if you just have to try to think of the pros and cons, and if you have more pros, right, for a Jetpack Compose than you have for XML, and obviously this goes around for cons. If you have less cons or more cons, you just need to try to balance this. And if you think that you can have much more fun with the other one because you have less things that you dislike and more things that you like, you should go with Jetpack Compose, or maybe stay with the Android view system. I can't really say that I found things that I don't like. I've heard misconceptions about it, like people complaining that maybe the actual preview is not working that well, or maybe that they shouldn't, that their functions or their UI becomes really bloated, right? Because as you know, the declarative approach, this kind of declarative approach where you define widgets like that, kind of tends to grow your lines of code really well, right? So you for maybe a few elements of UI, you gain a lot of numbers of lines, and they kind of complain and say that no, my UI just impossible to read. And I always try to counter this. So for the first thing with the preview, I always try to counter this, that the Jetpack library, these Jetpack libraries, or Compose to be more precise, is still early. I mean, okay, it's stable, it's the first version, but you can't really compare it with the XML and the view system that has been around for so many years, right? It's just a bit too early to jump on board and say that no, I don't like that, I don't like that. It's soon. Things will eventually mature, and all of these kind of unpleasant things might soften out in the future. And for the second thing that I've often heard, even from my students, saying that their UI is very hard to read because they have a lot of composables, right? And it's just difficult to understand. I always tell them that it's not really Jetpack Compose fault, it's their fault, because they should try to refactor and to structure their composables in a way that they don't have a composable function of 200 lines or 300 lines or something like that. It's just the way that you actually design your UI, and you have to refactor it and extract composables, not just keep all the UI in one composable function. And this is obviously this thing stands for Flutter, right, and for cross React Native. I'm sorry. So in there, I was having the same issues. I would have huge UI because you know, there would be the same tendency of the UI to grow with all of those widgets and all that stuff. And again, the fault was not really of the system, right? It was not really the fault of React Native or Flutter, or in this case, Jetpack Compose. It was my fault as a developer because I needed to make sure that the UI is correctly extracted and the composables are really well defined.
Yeah, what is a bit difficult for me with Compose are these different side effect methods. This is a bit tricky in my opinion, because there are so many of them. Like there's side effect and launched effect and disposable effect and derived state of, and I never really know when to use which one, but this is just practice, basically. It's just something you have to get used to, I guess. But that's something I find tricky about Compose.
I mean, I've also had issues with the effects, right? Until I understood that maybe a launch effect is a good effect that has to be used when you try to launch a query or something that has to happen just once and not across recompositions, right? So there are a lot of quirks that we have to get used to, and obviously this kind of style of defining your UI in a declarative approach is very different to what we are used to. It's obviously a huge change, but if there's something that is, I don't know, I would say in common for all developers, and you can see this really more for the senior experienced developers, is that they are resistant to change. And I think that, again, this is something natural. This is something in our nature, right? If for example, you're living in your house and you're fine and somebody gets you out and you have to live in a different house, right? You'll have this kind of, I don't know, feeling that you're not really, you don't belong to that place, right? So there's this kind of resistance to change. And it's natural. And this happens when you change any kind of technology stack, right? If you move from web to mobile and vice versa, you'll have this kind of resistance to change. So you'll try to maybe find yourself more in the previous stack or in the previous library. So again, this is something normal. And as you start to gain experience with it, as you start to play around with it more, you'll find that this kind of feeling of resistance towards a library will eventually soften out. And I'm saying this, that this happens really often. I've heard developers that are just like pro Java and they are really against Kotlin. I've heard developers that favor a library more than they favor another one. For example, people that are still big fans of libraries that maybe right now don't make too much sense, that maybe are deprecated or whatever. For example, the synthetics API, that's an API that I really liked. But I understand I have to use the view system because there were some, the view binding, I'm sorry, because there were some limitations, right? So again, this kind of resistance to change is natural. And again, you will see developers that are advocating for other libraries, and it's normal. It's something that is part of us.
Yeah, change is always uncomfortable, but
Yeah,
you have to get used to it as a programmer. Otherwise, you get left behind. And what I really like about Jetpack Compose is that you have the single source of truth for your composables and not like an XML. Where I always use this example of a checkbox, because when you put in a checkbox into your layout with XML, then even if you didn't wire up any code, you could start the app and you could check this checkbox and uncheck it, and it would actually have this animation where it's ticked and unticked. And this means that this view itself has its internal Boolean value for if the checkbox is checked or not. And when you have a bug in your code, you never really know if this is actually also the same value that you have in your view model for the checked value of this checkbox. So there are these two sources of truth that makes it harder to debug your code. But in Compose, because you always, the checkbox in Compose only has the value that you pass to this function, the Boolean value, true or false, for checked or not checked. And this way you know when the checkbox is checked, then also the Boolean that you pass to this checkbox function, to this composable function, is true. And this way you know that your value that you have in your view model and the checkbox state are always in sync. There's only the single source of truth. And this makes it less likely to introduce bugs in your code. So this is really right now, this is the main benefit I've seen from Compose, that it makes it less likely to add these bugs.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, I mean, I've seen this kind of approach, and I always tried to bypass it somehow, to hold the UI state in the view model and have the view model the only source of truth. And what's great about Compose is that the actual idea of unified or unidirectional flow of data that you have spoken about, and the idea of declarative widgets, right, declarative composables, this basically means that, okay, what I receive as a composable, this is what defines me, right? This is the state that I'm going to display. I don't have any kind of third-party actor that will come and mutate my state and produce, I don't know, this kind of weird state that you don't know how to debug. I mean, because with the views and the XML, you would have this really often, right? You'd have the view that would mutate the views, I mean, the activity or the fragment that would mutate the views in the XML. And the problem with that was that you would have different methods that would change different properties and different setters for those views, and you would basically never know what has caused that final state, or you would end up with illegal states and weird states that you would have to debug, mostly because there wouldn't be that kind of source of truth that you have spoken about.
Yeah, I also think Jetpack Compose is it's the future way of writing UIs, and I don't have much, or I don't have experience at all, basically, with stuff like iOS. But I think their UI system is similar to Compose. Do you know anything about it?
Yeah, so I mean, at the time that I started learning Jetpack Compose, I also started learning Swift UI, right, for iOS. Mostly because I'm a big fan of Kotlin multi-platform. Even though I haven't had the chance to play around with it, I'm planning. It's on my to-do list. And what I actually said was that, okay, I want to learn how to build UI with Jetpack Compose. And I noticed that iOS has this kind of Swift UI, right? That's really similar. It's on the declarative approach. It's just very, very similar. I mean, if you learn Jetpack Compose, you can really easily go on and play around with Swift UI. You just maybe have to learn the quirks of Swift, right, the language. But Swift UI as a framework, for example, for the UI, it's really similar to Jetpack Compose. And I think that what happened was that Jetpack Compose was announced or maybe released in the alpha version earlier than Swift UI. So I've heard about this, that many people were complaining that, oh my God, Android is just now finishing up with Compose, but iOS has this kind of declarative programming with Swift UI for so long now. And actually Jim's project at Google, hopefully I'm pronouncing his name correctly, has actually mentioned that Jetpack Compose was started before that. But again, I have to be honest about this, and I have to say that iOS was faster with the release cycle, because their Swift UI is more mature than our Compose is. If I'm not mistaken, they have more iterations than we have, and they have launched the first stable version earlier than we did. Hopefully, I'm not mistaken, but this is what I read at some point. So iOS has something that's in the same direction, and I think that this will fit really great as the future of mobile development.